I was preparing a family meal with my granddaughter when my daughter-in-law walked in and shouted, "Don't let that old man touch your food, he's contaminated." My son laughed as she added, "The only recipe he should be learning is how to disappear." My hands trembled, but I said nothing. Later that night, she found a legal document on the kitchen table that made her scream because I never thought I'd become the kind of man who'd burn his own family to protect what mattered most. But there I was at 72 years old, standing in my kitchen watching my 7-year-old granddaughter's face crumple as my daughter-in-law's words hung in the air like poison gas. "Don't let that old man touch your food, he's contaminated," Helena said, her voice dripping with contempt as she stood in the doorway wearing that designer dress she'd probably charged to Victor's credit card. Amira's small hands froze over the pot of arroz con pollo we'd been making together, her dark eyes going wide and confused, and I felt something inside my chest crack open like an egg hitting the edge of a bowl. My son Victor leaned against the doorframe behind his wife, not even bothering to hide his smirk, and I realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't just casual cruelty anymore. This was deliberate humiliation served up in my own home, the house I'd bought with money earned from 40 years of standing over hot stoves and building a restaurant empire from nothing but recipes my mother had taught me in a cramped apartment in the Bronx. I'd always been too soft, too willing to swallow insults and keep the peace because I thought that's what good fathers and grandfathers did, turning the other cheek and believing that love would eventually win out over meanness. But that particular flaw had let things deteriorate to this point, where my own flesh and blood felt comfortable spitting on me in front of a child. Helena continued her performance, walking across my kitchen like she owned it, which in her mind she probably did since she'd been slowly inserting herself into every corner of this house for the past 5 years. "The only recipe he should be learning," she said, looking directly at me with those cold green eyes, "is how to disappear." Victor actually laughed out loud at that, a genuine belly laugh like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week, and I watched my granddaughter's confused expression shift into something that looked like shame, like she was embarrassed to be associated with me. My hands trembled as I gripped the wooden spoon I'd been using to stir the rice, the same spoon my wife Maria had given me 30 years ago before cancer took her away and left me alone with a son who'd grown into a stranger. I wanted to scream, to throw them both out, to defend myself with the kind of fire I used to have when younger chefs would challenge my authority in restaurant kitchens, but instead I just stood there frozen like always, my voice caught somewhere in my throat while my pride bled out onto the tile floor. "I think it's time for Amira's bath," Helena announced, reaching for my granddaughter's hand and pulling her away from the stove. "Say goodbye to Grandpa, sweetheart." The way she said Grandpa made it sound like a disease, something shameful that needed to be washed off. Amira looked back at me as Helena led her toward the stairs, her little face twisted with uncertainty, and I managed to give her what I hoped was a reassuring smile, even though everything inside me was screaming. Victor lingered in the kitchen doorway for a moment, scrolling through his phone with deliberate indifference. "You know she's not wrong, Dad," he said without looking up from the screen, his voice casual like we were discussing the weather. "You're getting older and your hygiene isn't what it used to be. Maybe it's better if you stay out of the cooking from now on." "My hygiene is fine," I said quietly, hatting how weak my voice sounded. "I shower every morning and I wash my hands constantly when I cook, you know that." He shrugged, still not looking at me. "Helena's just concerned about Amira's health. You can't blame her for being a good mother." Then he walked away, leaving me alone in the kitchen I'd designed myself 15 years ago when I'd finally saved enough money to buy this house outright. No mortgage, just cash on the table because that's how I'd always done things, the old-fashioned way that people like Helena and Victor seemed to find so amusing and pathetic. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes just staring at the pot of half-finished rice, watching the steam rise and dissipate, thinking about all the meals I'd cooked in this kitchen, all the Sunday dinners and birthday celebrations and quiet Tuesday nights when it was just me and my memories and the comforting rhythm of chopping vegetables. My hands had stopped shaking, but something else had started, something cold and calculated spreading through my veins like ice water, and I realized that my biggest flaw wasn't just being too soft or too forgiving. It was believing that silence and endurance were the same thing as dignity, when really I'd just been teaching my son that disrespect had no consequences. That night after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my laptop open in front of me, something I rarely used but had learned to navigate well enough over the years. I started searching through old files, documents I'd scanned and saved years ago when my accountant had suggested I digitize everything important. Marriage certificates, property deeds, business incorporation papers, the will I'd drafted 5 years ago that left everything split evenly between Victor and his sister Rosa, who lived in California with her own family and barely spoke to any of us anymore. I pulled out a yellow legal pad from the drawer and started writing notes in my careful handwriting, the same precise script I used when developing new recipes, each line representing a different asset, a different piece of the life I'd built. The house was worth approximately $1.2 million in today's market, according to the last assessment. The restaurant group, which included 4 successful establishments across 3 boroughs, had been valued at somewhere around $8 million during the last tax filing. There were investment accounts, retirement funds, a small rental property in Queens that generated steady income. I'd never thought of myself as wealthy exactly, just comfortable after decades of hard work and careful saving, but seeing it all written out in front of me made me realize just how much power I actually held. Power I'd been giving away piece by piece every time I let Victor and Helena treat me like garbage in my own home. I placed a single envelope in the center of the table before I went to bed that night, but it was empty, just a placeholder for what was coming. Because tomorrow everything would change, though they wouldn't know it yet, wouldn't see the wheels I was about to set in motion. Sleep came hard and thin that night, my mind churning through possibilities and consequences, and I kept thinking about Amira's face when Helena had pulled her away from the stove, the way my granddaughter had looked at me with something that might have been pity or might have been fear, and I knew I couldn't let her grow up thinking that cruelty was normal, that people who loved you were supposed to make you feel contaminated and worthless. Over the next week I became a ghost in my own house, withdrawing into myself so completely that even Victor noticed and made some snide comment about me finally learning my place. I stopped cooking entirely, something I hadn't done in maybe 50 years, not since I was a teenager working my first restaurant job, and swearing I'd make something of myself in this industry that chewed people up and spit them out. Helena took over the kitchen with aggressive efficiency, posting pictures of her mediocre meals on social media with captions about finally bringing order to chaos and creating a clean, modern family environment, and I watched from the sidelines without saying a word. The silence was strategic this time though, not defeat but calculation, and every ignored insult was another brick in the wall I was building. I made phone calls from my bedroom with the door closed, reaching out to contacts I hadn't spoken to in years, lawyers and accountants and old friends from the restaurant business who owed me favors or respected me enough to help without asking too many questions. Luis Herrera came to visit on a Tuesday afternoon when Victor and Helena had taken Amira to some playdate across town. Luis had been my lawyer for 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to the lawsuit when a customer claimed food poisoning back in 2008, and he knew me well enough to sense immediately that something significant was happening. "Elias," he said as we sat in my bedroom office, "you sounded serious on the phone. What's going on?" I told him everything, not dramatically or emotionally, just laying out the facts the way I would explain a recipe to a new line cook. The insults, the humiliation, the way they'd been slowly pushing me out of my own life while positioning themselves to inherit everything I'd built. Luis listened without interrupting, his lawyer face giving nothing away, and when I finished, he pulled out his tablet and started taking notes. "What exactly do you want to accomplish here?" he asked, his pen hovering over the screen. "I want to protect my granddaughter," I said, "and I want them to understand what they've lost." "Revenge," Luis said bluntly. "Justice," I corrected, though we both knew it was the same thing dressed up in fancier clothes. He nodded slowly. "Okay, let's talk about options." We spent the next 3 hours going through scenarios, legal possibilities, the boundaries of what I could and couldn't do without opening myself up to lawsuits or challenges. Luis explained that while I couldn't technically kick them out of the house, immediately since Victor was listed as a co-owner on the deed through a joint tenancy arrangement I'd stupidly agreed to 5 years ago, I could do something else, something that would hurt much worse in the long run. "You revise your will," Luis said, warming to the idea as he talked it through. "Put everything into an irrevocable trust with Amira as the sole beneficiary. Include a clause that if Victor and Helena want to remain in the house, they agree to certain conditions, respect clauses if you will, and if they violate those conditions they have to vacate." "Can we do that?" I asked, my heart starting to beat faster. "It's your property, your assets, you can attach whatever strings you want." His smile was sharp, and here's the beautiful part. You make it irrevocable, meaning once it's done, even you can't undo it. That protects you from any accusations that they coerced or manipulated you later. We kept refining the plan over the following days, meeting in coffee shops and park benches like we were plotting something illegal instead of just an old man rearranging his estate. My stubbornness kicked in hard during those conversations, my tendency to dig in my heels when I thought I was right, and more than once Luis had to talk me down from additions that were too vindictive or legally questionable. "You want this to stand up in court," he reminded me when I suggested adding a clause that would publicly expose their treatment of me. "You want it airtight, not dramatic." I knew he was right, but part of me wanted the drama, wanted everyone to know what they'd done, and I had to constantly check that impulse toward public humiliation because it would ultimately undermine the whole plan. My flaws were showing themselves in new ways now that I'd decided to act instead of endure, the anger I'd suppressed for years bubbling up in ways that sometimes clouded my judgment. The documents were ready by the end of the second week. Lewis brought them to the house on a Friday afternoon, presenting them with the efficiency of a surgeon laying out instruments before an operation. I read through every page, even though the legal language made my head hurt, making sure I understood exactly what I was signing. Everything, the house, the restaurants, the investments, all of it went into the Amira Navarro Trust with me as the initial trustee until my death, at which point a professional trust company would take over until Amira turned 25. Victor and Helena could remain in the house under specific conditions. They had to treat me with basic respect and dignity. They had to allow me full access to all common areas including the kitchen, and they had to facilitate a relationship between me and Amira without interference. If they violated any of these terms, they had 30 days to vacate the premises and would lose all claim to any assets. The restaurants would continue operating under professional management, funneling profits into the trust. It was brutal and complete, and signing my name at the bottom of each page felt like dropping a bomb that wouldn't explode until I chose to detonate it. "When do you want to tell them?" Lewis asked as he gathered the signed documents into his briefcase. "Not yet," I said, my mind already planning the next phase. "Let them think they've won first." I continued my ghost routine for another week, watching Helena redecorate the living room with ugly modern furniture that probably cost thousands of dollars, watching Victor come home late from work smelling like whiskey and another woman's perfume, watching them build their perfect life on the foundation of my diminishment. My pride kept screaming at me to confront them immediately, to throw the papers in their faces and watch their expressions collapse, but I forced myself to wait because I wanted the moment to be perfect, wanted them to feel completely secure before I pulled the rug out. That was probably another flaw, the need to control every aspect of the revenge, to choreograph it like one of my elaborate tasting menus, where each course built on the last until the final stunning conclusion. But I couldn't help myself, couldn't resist the urge to make this hurt as much as possible. The opportunity came on a Sunday evening 3 weeks after Helena's contamination comment. They'd invited some friends over for dinner, other young couples from their social circle who worked in finance or tech and spoke in that aggressive shorthand about markets and disruption. Helena had spent all day cooking, which was generous since mostly she'd ordered expensive prepared foods from Whole Foods and arranged them on plates. I'd stayed in my room during the preparation, emerging only when the doorbell started ringing and guests began arriving. Victor saw me coming down the stairs and his face went tight. "Dad," he said in a low voice, intercepting me in the hallway, "maybe it's better if you eat in your room tonight. This is kind of a couple's thing." "This is my house," I said quietly, hearing my own voice like it belonged to someone else. "I'll eat where I want." His jaw clenched. "Don't embarrass me, please." "Embarrass you?" I felt something hot rising in my chest. "How exactly would I embarrass you, Victor?" "Just he waved his hand vaguely. "You're not really part of this crowd. You wouldn't understand the conversations." I walked past him into the dining room where Helena was lighting candles on the table, a beautiful spread that would have looked even better if she'd actually cooked any of it herself. She looked up and saw me, her face flashing irritation before settling into her public smile. "Elias," she said with false warmth, "I didn't realize you'd be joining us." The other guests were already seated, 4 couples in their 30s wearing the kind of casual expensive clothes that cost more than my first car. They looked at me with polite curiosity, probably wondering who the old man was. "Everyone," Helena announced, "this is Victor's father Elias. He lives here with us." The way she said, "lives here with us," instead of "we live in his house," was masterful, a complete inversion of reality delivered so smoothly that no one questioned it. I took a seat at the end of the table, the chair that used to be my designated spot until Helena had rearranged everything, and watched the dinner party unfold around me. The conversation flowed in directions I couldn't follow, cryptocurrencies and startup valuations and vacation houses in the Hamptons, and I felt genuinely old for the first time in years, disconnected from this world my son had entered. But I also felt clear-headed and purposeful in a way I hadn't experienced since Maria died, because I knew something they didn't, knew that all of this was built on sand that was about to wash away. Victor kept shooting me warning looks across the table, probably afraid I'd say something to embarrass him, while Helena performed her role as gracious hostess with practiced ease. At one point, she started telling a story about how she was remodeling the kitchen, talking about plans to rip out my custom cabinets and install some modern monstrosity, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at the absurdity of it. Actually, I said during a pause in the conversation, my voice cutting through the chatter, I have an announcement to make. The table went quiet, everyone turning to look at me. Victor's face drained of color like he thought I was about to have a medical emergency or say something insane. Helena's smile stayed frozen in place, but her eyes went hard. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope I'd been carrying for days, the one I'd filled with copies of the trust documents. I've made some changes to my estate planning, I said conversationally. Placing the envelope on the table, I thought you should know, Victor, since it affects you directly. Dad, Victor said through clenched teeth, this isn't the time or place. Actually, it's the perfect time, I said, my heart hammering but my voice steady. You've been telling me for weeks that I need to step back, that I'm too old and contaminated to be part of the family, so I've taken your advice. I slid the envelope across the table toward Helena, who picked it up with trembling fingers. Everything I own, the house, the restaurants, all the assets, they now belong to Amira through an irrevocable trust. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the candles flickering. Helena tore open the envelope and started reading, her face going from pale to flushed as she scanned the pages. Victor grabbed the papers from her hands, his eyes moving frantically across the legal text. This is insane, Victor said, his voice rising. You can't do this. I already did, I replied calmly, and felt a surge of satisfaction at the panic spreading across his features. It's irrevocable, which means even I can't undo it. The house belongs to Amira now. The restaurants belong to Amira. Everything belongs to Amira. Helena stood up so fast her chair fell over backward with a crash. Where are we supposed to live? She shrieked, all pretense of composure gone. What are we supposed to do? You can stay here, I said, enjoying the way her expression shifted from panic to hope and then back to panic as I continued. As long as you follow certain conditions. Basic respect, dignity, treating me like a human being instead of contaminated garbage. If you can manage that, you're welcome to remain in the house. If not, you have 30 days to find somewhere else. This is elder abuse, Helena hissed, her voice shaking. You're senile, you're not thinking clearly. We'll contest this, we'll have you declared incompetent. Lewis had anticipated this exact response and coached me on how to handle it. The trust was created with full psychiatric evaluation confirming my mental competency, I said, reciting the script we'd practiced. Any attempt to contest it will result in immediate forfeiture of all access to the assets, including this house. That clause is very specifically spelled out in Section 7 if you want to check. The dinner guests were watching this unfold like spectators at a car crash, their expensive meals forgotten. Victor was still reading through the documents, his face cycling through different shades of red and white as he absorbed each new revelation. Helena turned to the guests with wild eyes, seeking sympathy or support or maybe just witnesses to what she clearly viewed as an outrageous injustice. He's stealing from his own son, she announced to the room. This is financial abuse. One of the women at the table, someone I didn't recognize, cleared her throat uncomfortably. Maybe we should go, she suggested to her partner. No, Helena shouted. Stay, you're all witnesses to this, he's not in his right mind. But they were already gathering their things, the evening ruined beyond recovery, and within 5 minutes the dining room had emptied except for me, Victor, and Helena. My son looked at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before, not just anger but genuine hurt, like he couldn't comprehend what I'd done. Why? He asked, and his voice cracked on the word. We're your family, how could you do this? You stopped being my family the moment you let your wife call me contaminated, I said, feeling tears threatening but refusing to let them fall. You stopped being my family when you laughed about it, when you made your own daughter feel ashamed to be around me. My voice was rising now, all the controlled calm evaporating into raw emotion. I built everything you have. This house, those restaurants, the money in your bank account, all of it came from me working 80-hour weeks and missing your school plays and sacrificing everything for your future. And what did you do? You treated me like I was nothing, like I was garbage to be swept into the corner and ignored. We never said you were nothing, Victor protested weakly. You didn't have to say it. The words erupted from me like steam from a pressure valve. You showed it every single day with your comments and your eye rolls and the way you let Helena erase me from my own home. You know what the worst part is. It's not the insults or the disrespect. It's that you made Amira think less of me. You let her see me through your cruel eyes instead of letting her know who I really am. Helena stepped forward and I could see her trying to regain control, shifting tactics from anger to manipulation. Elias, she said in a softer voice, I know we haven't always gotten along, but this is extreme. Think about what you're doing to your granddaughter. She needs stability, she needs her parents to be secure. She needs to grow up knowing that cruelty has consequences, I shot back. She needs to learn that you can't treat people like garbage just because you think you have power over them. So what happens now? Victor asked, slumping into his chair like all the air had gone out of him. We just, live here under your rules like prisoners. You live here under the conditions spelled out in the trust, I corrected, which basically amount to treating me like a human being. If that feels like prison to you, then maybe that tells you everything you need to know about how you've been acting. The next few days were thick with tension, so heavy you could taste it. Helena moved through the house like a caged animal, furious and desperate, making phone calls to lawyers who all told her the same thing Lewis had already explained to me, that the trust was airtight and any challenge would only make things worse. Victor alternated between angry silence and attempts at reconciliation that felt hollow because they were motivated by fear of losing everything rather than genuine remorse. I overheard them fighting in their bedroom one night, Helena's voice rising through the walls. "This is your fault," she screamed at him. "You should have controlled him better. You should have seen this coming." And Victor's response, weak and defensive. How was I supposed to know he'd go crazy like this? I spent more time with Amira during those days, taking advantage of the clause in the trust that guaranteed me unrestricted access to my granddaughter. We cooked together in the kitchen that Helena no longer tried to claim as her territory, and I taught Amira the recipes my mother had taught me, the ones that carried history and memory in every ingredient. "Why is Mommy so angry?" Amira asked one afternoon as we rolled out dough for empanadas. Her question was direct in that way children have of cutting through adult complications to reach the heart of things. "Because I made a decision she doesn't like," I told her honestly. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree about important things." "Did you have a fight?" "Yes, we did." She thought about this while pressing cookie cutters into the dough. "Daddy says you're being mean." That hurt more than I'd expected, hearing my son poison my granddaughter against me even now. "Do you think I'm being mean?" I asked her. Amira looked up at me with those serious dark eyes that reminded me so much of Maria. "I think you're sad," she said simply, and I had to turn away to hide the tears that finally came, hot and unstoppable. She was right, of course. Beneath all the anger and the calculated revenge, I was just desperately sad about what my family had become, about the fact that I'd had to resort to legal warfare to protect the one pure relationship I had left. But the sadness didn't stop what came next. 2 weeks after the dinner party explosion, Helena violated one of the trust conditions in a way so blatant it was almost like she wanted to force the issue. I'd come downstairs one morning to find she'd changed all the locks on the kitchen, installing a keypad entry system, and refusing to give me the code. "The kitchen is off limits until we can establish better hygiene protocols," she announced, standing in front of the locked door like a guard. "This is for Amira's protection." I didn't argue or yell, I just pulled out my phone and called Lewis. "She violated Section 3, subsection B, I told him calmly while Helena watched with narrowed eyes. "Denial of access to common areas. Activate the 30-day clause." I saw her face change as she realized what I'd done, saw the moment she understood that her attempt at a power play had just accelerated her own destruction. Lewis filed the notice that afternoon, a formal legal document delivered by courier that informed Victor and Helena they had 30 days to vacate the premises or face forcible eviction. The document was cold and clinical in its language, listing the specific violation and the consequence, and there was no room for negotiation or appeal. "You're really doing this," Victor said when he came home and found the notice on the kitchen table. "You're actually throwing us out." "You threw yourselves out," I corrected. "I gave you clear boundaries. Helena chose to cross them." "Where are we supposed to go?" His voice had taken on a quality I'd never heard before, something that sounded almost like begging. "We don't have money for rent, not the kind of place Helena's used to." "That's not my problem to solve," I said, and the words felt cruel coming out of my mouth but also necessary, like cauterizing a wound. "You're 40 years old, Victor. You have a job. Figure it out." Helena appeared in the doorway, her face blotchy from crying. "Please," she said, and the words seemed to cost her everything. "I'll apologize. I'll do whatever you want. Don't do this to Amira." "Don't you dare use my granddaughter as a shield," I said, feeling my temper flare hot. "You didn't think about Amira when you were teaching her to be ashamed of me. You didn't think about her when you were using cruelty as entertainment. This is about protecting her from learning that your behavior is acceptable." "You're a vindictive old man," Helena spat, her brief attempt at humility evaporating. "You're doing this because your ego can't handle that we don't worship you anymore." "I'm doing this because you mistook kindness for weakness," I replied evenly, "and because someone needed to teach you that actions have consequences." The 30 days crawled by with excruciating slowness. Victor and Helena tried everything, tears and threats and attempts to turn other family members against me, but I'd prepared for all of it, had documentation and witnesses to their behavior. My stubbornness, that flaw that had caused me problems my whole life, became an asset now as I refused to budge even slightly from the terms of the trust. There were moments I almost wavered, nights when I lay awake wondering if I'd gone too far, if my desire for revenge had overridden my better judgment. My pride wouldn't let me admit out loud that maybe I was being too harsh, but privately I struggled with it, with the knowledge that I was fundamentally changing my relationship with my son in ways that might never heal. But then I'd remember Amira's face when Helena called me contaminated, and my resolve would harden again. This wasn't just about revenge, I told myself. It was about breaking a cycle of cruelty before it damaged another generation. That justification helped me sleep at night, even as I watched my son and daughter-in-law pack their lives into boxes with defeated efficiency. They found an apartment in Queens, a 2-bedroom place that was fine but unremarkable, nothing like the house they were leaving. Helena cried the entire time they loaded the moving truck, dramatic sobs that I watched from my bedroom window with a mixture of satisfaction and guilt. My flaws were on full display during those final days. My inability to extend an olive branch even when I saw genuine suffering, my need to watch them experience every moment of the consequences I'd engineered. On the last day, Victor knocked on my bedroom door. "Can we talk?" he asked, and he looked older somehow, diminished by the experience in ways that went beyond just losing wealth. We sat in my study, the room where I used to help him with homework when he was Amira's age, and the irony of that memory wasn't lost on either of us. "I know you think this is what I deserve," he started, his voice careful and measured. "And maybe you're right, maybe we did treat you badly. But Dad, you've destroyed our lives over words, over insults that we didn't even mean seriously." "You destroyed your own lives," I said, but I could hear my voice wavering slightly, the first crack in my certainty. "I just held up a mirror to your choices." "You held up a nuclear bomb," he corrected, "and you dropped it on your own family." He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "I'm not asking you to undo this. I know you can't even if you wanted to. But I'm asking you to think about Amira. She's going to grow up knowing her grandfather drove her parents out of their home. How is that protecting her?" That hit harder than I wanted to admit because I'd been avoiding that exact question. "She'll understand when she's older," I said, but it sounded weak even to my ears. "She'll understand that I was protecting her inheritance, protecting her from people who value money and status over kindness." "Will she?" Victor asked. "Or will she just remember that her family fell apart and her grandfather was the one who made it happen?" He stood up to leave, pausing at the door. "I hope you're right, Dad. I hope this was worth it. Because you're going to be living in this big house all alone with nothing but your righteousness to keep you company." After they left, the silence was deafening. I walked through rooms that suddenly felt enormous and empty, my footsteps echoing on hardwood floors that had once thundered with family life. The kitchen, my sanctuary, felt sterile without Amira's laughter or even Helena's irritating presence. I'd won, completely and decisively, and it felt nothing like I'd imagined. The satisfaction I'd expected was thin and hollow, replaced by a gnawing sense that maybe I'd let my flaws, my stubbornness and pride and need for control, drive me to a victory that was really just another form of loss. I tried to tell myself it would get better, that time would prove I'd made the right choice, but that first night alone in the house I'd fought so hard to reclaim, I wasn't sure I believed it. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. Amira visited on weekends, brought over by a Victor who was coldly polite but never stayed longer than necessary. Helena stopped coming entirely, sending terse text messages about pickup times and dietary restrictions. I threw myself into cooking with renewed energy, developing new recipes in my kitchen like I was proving something to invisible judges. The restaurants continued thriving under professional management, the trust generating steady income that I barely touched because I'd never cared much about money anyway, just about the work and the craft and the legacy. Lewis checked in regularly, making sure I was okay, and I lied to him consistently because admitting I was lonely would feel like admitting defeat. Then one Saturday, about 2 months after Victor and Helena moved out, Amira arrived for her visit carrying a small notebook. "Mommy said I should write down all the recipes you teach me," she announced, settling onto a stool at the kitchen counter, "so I can remember them when I'm older." It was such a transparent attempt to document my methods for some future contest of the will that I almost laughed. But then I looked at my granddaughter's eager face and realized she had no idea she was being used as a pawn in an adult war. We spent the afternoon making my mother's recipe for flan, and Amira wrote everything down in careful block letters, asking questions about measurements and techniques that showed she was actually paying attention. "When I grow up," she said while we waited for the custard to set, "I want to have a restaurant like you did." "Why?" I asked, curious about what stories she'd been told. "Because you made food that made people happy," she said simply. "Daddy told me you used to work all the time when he was little, but that people would come from all over the city to eat your cooking because it was special." The fact that Victor had told her positive stories about me, even now, even after everything, did something complicated to my heart. Maybe my son wasn't entirely lost to bitterness. Maybe there was still something salvageable in our relationship, though I wasn't sure I had the humility to reach for it first. 4 months after the eviction, a letter arrived in the mail from a law firm I didn't recognize. My first thought was that Helena had finally found some legal angle to challenge the trust, but when I opened it, the contents were stranger than that. It was a formal notice that an investigative journalist had filed a Freedom of Information request regarding my restaurant group, looking into workplace safety violations and employment practices from the 1990s. The letter was vague about specifics, but threatening in its implications, and I knew immediately that Helena was behind it somehow, trying to damage my reputation if she couldn't reclaim the money. I called Lewis, who started making inquiries, and within a week we'd confirmed that Helena had been shopping a story to various media outlets about my supposed history of exploiting workers, complete with anonymous testimonials from people who'd supposedly worked for me decades ago. Most of it's garbage, Lewis reported after reviewing the allegations, but there's one claim that might have teeth. A former kitchen worker says you failed to report a grease fire properly in 1996, putting employees at risk. I remembered that fire, a small flare-up that had been contained within minutes, nothing that had required reporting under the standards of the time. But standards had changed, and someone could make it look worse than it was if they tried hard enough. She's trying to destroy you, Lewis said unnecessarily. If this story runs, it could damage the restaurant's reputation, which damages Amira's inheritance. The realization that Helena would hurt her own daughter's financial future just to strike back at me was stunning in its cruelty, and I felt my anger reignite with fresh intensity. But I was also tired of fighting and scheming and living in a state of constant warfare. Let her publish it, I told Lewis. If people want to judge my entire career based on one incident from 30 years ago, that's their choice. I know the truth about who I am and what I built. That's very noble, Lewis said dryly, but it's also naive. This kind of publicity could seriously impact the business. We should fight it. We ended up fighting it not with lawyers but with truth, reaching out to dozens of former employees who'd worked for me over the decades and asking them to speak on record about their experiences. The response was overwhelming and humbling. People I hadn't talked to in years sending testimonials about how I'd mentored them, promoted from within, paid fair wages when other restaurants were exploiting immigrant labor. One former sous chef, now running his own successful restaurant in Brooklyn, wrote an entire article for a food magazine about how I'd taught him not just cooking but dignity in the kitchen, how I'd refused to tolerate the abusive screaming chef culture that was common in the industry. The article got picked up and went somewhat viral in food circles, completely overwhelming Helena's attempted hit piece before it even ran. But the victory felt hollow because I knew it had cost me something too, had forced me to call in favors and expose myself to public scrutiny in ways I'd always avoided. The final twist came almost exactly a year after I'd served the eviction notice. Amira, now 8 years old, asked if she could sleep over at my house one weekend. "Just me and you, Grandpa," she said, like a special cooking camp. Helena agreed with suspicious ease, and when I picked Amira up on Friday evening, my granddaughter was carrying a small suitcase and a determined expression. We made dinner together, pasta carbonara that came out perfect, and then settled onto the couch to watch a movie. Halfway through, during a scene where a family was arguing, Amira suddenly said, "I know what you did." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I know you made Mommy and Daddy leave," she said, not looking at me, keeping her eyes on the screen. "I heard them talking about it, about the trust and the rules and how you took everything away." I reached for the remote and paused the movie, turning to face her fully. This was the conversation I'd been dreading and knew was inevitable, the moment where I'd have to explain my actions to the one person whose opinion actually mattered. "Yes," I said simply, "I did do that. Did they tell you why?" "Mommy says you're mean and crazy," Amira recited, and I could hear Helena's voice in the words. "But Daddy says it's more complicated than that." She finally looked at me, her face serious. "Why did you do it, Grandpa? If you loved us, why did you make us leave?" I thought about lying or softening the truth, but I'd built this entire campaign on the principle that Amira deserved to grow up understanding consequences and honesty. "Because they were treating me badly," I said carefully. "They were saying cruel things and making me feel like I didn't matter, and I needed them to understand that was wrong. So I used the only power I had, which was money and ownership, to teach them that lesson." "But now everyone's sad," Amira pointed out with devastating clarity. "Mommy cries a lot, Daddy works late all the time, and you're here by yourself in this big house." She leaned against my shoulder. "I think maybe the lesson didn't work the way you wanted it to." Out of the mouths of babes, as they say. My 8-year-old granddaughter had just articulated what I'd been trying not to admit for months, that my carefully planned revenge had achieved its goals while simultaneously failing completely. I taught Helena and Victor about consequences, sure, but I'd also taught Amira that love comes with conditions, that family can dissolve over money and pride. You might be right, I admitted, my voice rough with emotion I couldn't quite control. I think I let my anger make me do something that hurt everyone, including me. Can you fix it? She asked with the hopefulness of someone who hadn't yet learned that some things stay broken. I don't know, I told her honestly. Some things, once you break them, you can't put back together the same way. But her question stuck with me over the following days, burrowing into my brain and refusing to leave. Could I fix it? The trust was irrevocable, the legal structures couldn't be undone even if I wanted to. But maybe fixing it didn't mean reversing what I'd done. Maybe it meant finding a way forward that acknowledged the damage while building something new. I called Victor on a Tuesday evening, my hands shaking as I dialed because my pride still made this incredibly difficult. Can we talk? I asked when he answered, in person, just you and me. He was silent for so long I thought he might hang up. Okay, he finally said. When? We met at a diner halfway between his apartment and my house, neutral territory that smelled like coffee and French fries. Victor looked tired, older than his 40 years, and I wondered if I looked the same to him, if this war had aged us both beyond our actual years. We ordered coffee and sat in uncomfortable silence until the waitress left. Amira asked me if I could fix this, I said, diving in before I could lose my nerve. And I realized I don't even know what fixing it would look like. You could give us back the house, Victor said immediately, and I could hear the hope threading through his voice. I can't, I said, shaking my head. The trust is irrevocable, but even if I could, I don't think that would actually fix anything. It would just reset us to where we were before, with you and Helena treating me like garbage and me swallowing it to keep the peace. We didn't treat you like garbage, Victor protested, but it was weak, automatic. Yes, you did, I said firmly, and you need to admit that before we can move forward with anything. You let your wife call me contaminated in front of my granddaughter, Victor. You laughed about me disappearing. Those aren't small things. He stared at his coffee cup for a long moment. You're right, he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him something. We did treat you badly, I treated you badly. I got so wrapped up in Helena's worldview, in this idea that we were the new generation and you were just this relic we had to tolerate, that I forgot who you actually were, what you'd actually done for me. His voice cracked slightly. I forgot that you were my dad, not just some obstacle to navigate. Hearing him say it, actually acknowledge the cruelty instead of minimizing it, did something to the knot of anger I'd been carrying in my chest. I could have handled it differently, I admitted. I could have talked to you, set boundaries, demanded respect without blowing up our entire family structure. But my pride wouldn't let me do it the easy way. I needed you to hurt the way you'd hurt me. Mission accomplished, Victor said with a bitter smile. We're definitely hurting. So where does that leave us? I asked. Because I miss my son. I miss having a family that's more than just scheduled visitation with my granddaughter, but I don't know how to get there from here. We talked for 2 more hours, drinking bad diner coffee and picking at eggs we didn't really want, trying to map a path forward that neither of us was sure existed. Victor admitted that his marriage to Helena had been strained by the move, that losing the house had exposed cracks in their relationship that had always been there, but were easier to ignore when they were comfortable. I admitted that living alone in that big house had shown me that victory without family was just another form of prison. We didn't solve everything that night, couldn't possibly untangle years of resentment and mistakes in one conversation, but we made a start, agreed to keep talking, to work towards something that looked like reconciliation, even if it would never look like it did before. The resolution, such as it is, came slowly over the following year. Victor and I started having regular dinners, just the 2 of us, rebuilding our relationship piece by careful piece. Helena and I achieved a cold truce that would probably never warm into real affection, but at least allowed us to be in the same room without warfare. The trust remained intact, Amira's future secured in ways that meant Victor and Helena had to actually work for their lifestyle, instead of coasting on my achievements. I hired Victor to help manage the restaurant group's day-to-day operations, giving him a real role and real compensation, but not the ownership he'd assumed was his birthright. It was messy and imperfect, and bore no resemblance to the happy ending I'd imagined when I first started planning my revenge. But the unexpected twist came from Amira herself. On her 9th birthday, she announced that she wanted to write a letter to be opened when she turned 25 and took control of the trust. We all gathered at my house for her party, the first time Victor and Helena had been there since moving out, and Amira made us all sit around the kitchen table while she read what she'd written. Dear future me, she read in her clear child's voice, Grandpa Elias gave you everything he built because people hurt his feelings and he wanted to protect you. but I think he was also sad and angry and maybe didn't make all the best choices. When you get this money in these restaurants, I hope you'll use them to bring the family back together instead of keeping people apart. Money can make people mean, but it can also make people generous. Choose generous. Love, Amira, who is 9 years old. I had to leave the room because I was crying too hard to hide it, overwhelmed by my granddaughter's wisdom and the realization that she'd understood everything more clearly than any of us adults had managed. Later that evening, after everyone had left and I was cleaning up alone in my kitchen, I found another envelope on the table, this one addressed to me in Amira's careful handwriting. Inside was a drawing she'd made, our whole family including Helena standing together in front of the house, all of us smiling. At the bottom she'd written, "This is what fixing it looks like." She was right, of course. My meticulous revenge had achieved its goals, had taught the lessons I'd wanted to teach and protected what I'd wanted to protect. But it had also revealed my own flaws in stark detail, my stubbornness and pride and need for control, my inability to forgive or to build instead of destroy. I'd won the battle completely while losing something more important in the process. The house was mine, the money was secured for Amira, Victor and Helena had learned their lesson about consequences. But I was still essentially alone, living in my big empty house with nothing but my righteousness and my regrets for company, wondering if maybe there was a difference between justice and revenge that I'd failed to appreciate when I was planning my meticulous destruction of my own family's stability. The real twist wasn't in the documents, or the legal maneuvering, or the dramatic eviction. It was in the mirror my granddaughter held up showing me that the contaminated one all along might have been me, poisoned by my own bitterness into creating exactly the isolation I'd claimed I was fighting against.